All right, so we're very happy to welcome Natalie Kurz to 18F today. She is an expert content strategist and all-around UX practitioner, from what I hear. And she's here to share some of her knowledge that she's built up, both at her time at CFPB and also doing a lot of independent consulting work for various companies, building their content strategies. So thanks very much for being here, Natalie, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks for having me. As you said, my name is Natalie Kurz, and I am a user experience designer and content strategist with the CFPB. And I've been doing that work for about 15 years now, kind of off and on. It hasn't been a very linear pathway for me to get where I am, but cumulatively about 15 years. I have a master's in journalism from NYU, and I just kind of put up here three of my own personal philosophies when it comes to design work, just to share with you. So, obligatory slide with lots of logos. These are some of the people that I've worked for doing content strategies for, various iterations, various stages of their maturity. We won't spend any more time talking about that. So what is content strategy? That's what we're here to talk about, right? That's what hopefully most of you want to know. This is one of my favorite definitions of content strategy, and there have been many ways that people have defined content strategy. And I always look to people who are much smarter than I am, and I consider Kevin Nichols in that group. So he says we define content strategy as getting the right content to the right user at the right time, right? So if you kind of put this in a journalistic framework, it's the what, it's the who, and the when of your content. If you think about like the 5 whys when you're in junior high, that's really what we're talking about, right? So what is the content that we're trying to get out to our users? What's the messaging, right? That's the right content piece. The right user, who are we talking to? Who are these personas? What are their needs? And then the right time, at what point in their journey are we reaching them, right? At what point in the website are they going to be looking at this content when we're talking about digital content? So what does that actually look like, right? So content strategy is kind of this nebulous thing that happens behind the scenes. Lots of people talk about it, but like it's a concrete thing, it's a process. So one of the ways that I like to start explaining content strategy is I like to look at 404 error pages, because it's a really easy way in a bite-sized snippet to find out practicing using content strategy within their brand. So this is one from Brooks Brothers. It says, the page you requested cannot be found. The page you're looking for might have been removed, had its name changed, or is temporarily unavailable. And then it gives you lots of different suggestions about what you can do. We've got these cute little bloodhounds like sniffing out the answers on the side there. It's very in line with the Brooks Brothers brand, right? It's very sophisticated and polite and gentle. It's very directional and encouraging. So it fits within that brand. Somebody put some thought into creating this 404 page. There was a content strategy behind it. On another spectrum, this is Urban Outfitters 404 page, right? Very different kind of feeling, but still in keeping with their brand, right? It's kind of in your face, it's kind of snarky, maybe makes you feel a little guilty, possibly like wearing their clothes does, but it definitely shows a very strong brand, right? There is a content strategy here. So now I'm going to pick on the CFPB. This is our current live 404 page, right? This is a huge missed opportunity to connect with our users, right? There's branding, but it's all around the content. It's not within the content of the page itself. We're not giving any suggestions on what users can be doing. We're not thinking about the users, at all, really. So actually in our beta now, you can see this is what we've updated it to. So much more in keeping with an actual brand. We have some direction here, right? Visit the homepage, contact us. There's a level of playfulness here. So there's something happening, right? So we are moving in the right direction. I also, of course, had to take a look at 18F's 404. And I think it's great. It has a lot of personality. It gives you options. And it definitely speaks to who you are, that you worked really hard to find the page, but you just couldn't do it. It gives a sense that you're working for the people. So I thought that was great. How many people in here have heard the phrase content is king? Is that something most people are familiar with? That's good, because it's true. The reason that I can say it's true is, like, when's the last time you emailed your friend a URL and said, oh my gosh, can you imagine how fast this thing loads? How fast is this page, right? Or you're on Twitter and you're talking with your friends, like, did you see that they changed their font to Avenir, book? Like, those are not the conversations that we're having. I mean, people in here might be having those conversations, but generally speaking, people are not having those conversations. So it's the content, right? That's what we're there for. We go to websites to seek information. So if our information isn't usable or isn't useful to people, then we're not doing our jobs. So the notion of content is king is absolutely correct. So if content is king, then content strategy are the laws of the land, right? These are what govern the content. It provides the framework for organizing and delivering and maintaining your content. So let's talk a little more about like, what is this thing? Like I said, it's sometimes hard for people to wrap their head around like, what is this umbrella of content strategy? So again, looking to people who are much smarter than I am, Christina Halverson says, it's the planning for the creation, the delivery, and governance of useful, usable content. There's a lot of meaning in that sentence, a lot of really good meaning in that sentence. So it's the planning, right? It's a strategy. Content strategy is first and foremost a strategy. It means it's the thing that gets everyone driving toward the same goal. Creation, right? What is being written? What are the guidelines? How are we communicating with people? Delivery, where is it going? How is it getting there? How is it structured for consumption? Governance, who's responsible for it, right? A lot of times we overlook this piece. Who's actually getting the content in? Who's approving it? Who's uploading it? What is the content life cycle? Does it ever expire? Those are all really important questions to tackle in a content strategy. And then at the end of the sentence, you talk about useful. What purpose does it solve? All content should serve a purpose. If it doesn't belong. And then usable, how is it structured? Web content is very different in the way it should be structured than, let's say, a poster or a billboard or a book, right? So you want to make sure it's usable for the medium that you're conveying it in. Another really great definition is content strategy is to copywriting as information architecture is to design. So IAs kind of become a standard operating procedure now in the design process. You really wouldn't think about moving forward without having some kind of IA framework in place. Yet people jump right into copywriting with having absolutely no content strategy in place. So I find this to be a really great analogy when you're trying to convince like a stakeholder, a project manager, your boss on like why it's important to have content strategy to help them understand how important it is, right? Just like IA was to design, content strategy is for copywriting. So talking about that, it's content strategy is more than just copywriting, right? A lot of people confuse the two. Copywriting is part of it, but it's really the planning, it's messaging, it's structure, the delivery, maintenance, and governance. It's all of these things. It's a strategy, first and foremost. Had a lot of discussions, and I think we'll continue to have discussions about, well, when does this thing happen, right? Is it something that you bring in someone at the very beginning of a project and then they roll off and you don't think about it again? And the answer is a resounding no. Content strategy is an umbrella that lives over an entire project. So this is true whether you're working in a waterfall or an agile project flow. Content strategy is something that everybody should be thinking about all the time. And I'm going to talk about some different ways in which you can approach content strategy from the different disciplines that should be touching it. So there's a lot of things that go into it, right? It's the discovery, you're doing messaging and planning. Within the design part, you're doing structure, you're doing the presentation layer, there's some copywriting. And then even within the development, you should be thinking about content strategy, building content models, working with your developers to understand how information should be put into your CMS, right? Making sure that the editorial staff that needs to put the content in has the ability to do what they need to do as part of the governance. So who are content strategists, right? This is a question I get a lot. It's a lot of different people, right? But most importantly, it's you. Regardless of what your title is or what your role is on a project, you're thinking about your content because as we talked about, content is king, right? Everything we do is to deliver content. So it should be part of everybody's responsibility on a project team as they're moving forward and building a product. So basically, we're all kind of mutts. Like we all bring different types of disciplines into the way we approach content strategy. Content strategy crosses a lot of different disciplines, and there are a lot of different ways that you can approach it, which is why I think it's so great. So let's talk about that. Let's dig into that a little bit more. there's kind of 3 different approaches to content strategy. All 3 are necessary, but if you're someone who's new to content strategy, this might be a way in. You might identify yourself as being a more strategic thinker or more over the technical side if you're a front-end developer. These might be ways for you to start thinking about content strategy and relating it specifically to what you're doing and what you're bringing to the table. So having the journalistic background that I did, I kind of came into content strategy through the editorial door. That's what made the most sense to me. And then I've kind of learned the other approaches along the way. So let's break down the strategic approach. This is looking at things like gap analysis, personas, goals of your user, right? Looking at big picture things. What content exists? What do we need to create? Who's our target audience? How are we going to communicate with them? It's part of that right user, right? Remember, the right content to the right user at the right time. This is kind of focused on the right user. Who are we talking to? How are we going to help them meet their goals as we move forward? So next you have that editorial approach. So this is voice and tone, right? How are we speaking to people? It's a style guide. It's the messaging perspective. How can we convey our message? The specific mechanics around writing. How do we connect to the user in a way that's going to make them responsive, right? So this is the right content piece of that, right content, right user at the right time. And then you have the technical approach. So this is looking at things like metadata, structure, an implementation perspective. It's very data-driven, right? Looking at how your content is chunked in your content management system. How is content reused? And we'll touch in all of these things as we get further in. And how are we delivering content to users? So this is that right time piece of that statement. So I'm always a big fan of things where I can walk away and like do the thing the next day. So that's my hope, is that tomorrow you can take some of the things that you're learning here today and actually implement them within your project. So I'm kind of broke it down into 6 pieces of the things that make up a content strategy. So content strategy is kind of a process. It's kind of a living thing. It's not like one thing and then you're done, right? It's something that lives and breathes and grows as your project. Different stages and deliverables that can be associated with a content strategy. I could talk for hours about that, but you don't want to hear that. So I broke it down into kind of 6 key pieces that I found to work really well at getting the core of what a content strategy needs to be, doing it quickly. And I've found this to kind of be the best way to get the heavy lifting done without having to do every single piece of the step. So first is the inventory. This is kind of the quantitative piece. And yes, this is just a big spreadsheet. That is what you're dealing with here. It's not fun, it's not glamorous, but it is absolutely essential. So the goal of this is to take a snapshot of like what content exists today, right? This is assuming that you're working off of like a redesign. It's not a new site that you're building or a new product that you're building. Although even then there will be some assets that you need to inventory, right? Whether it's a PDF library or offline materials or whatever it is, there's always some content that you need to look at to go into what you're going to be creating. So you should start thinking about mapping the current state to the future state, right? So looking at what exists today, how is it structured, what components are on each page, who is the audience for each page. There are definitely people that tell you can automate this kind of a thing, and there are tools, there are ways that you can scrape content and get a really quick inventory. I personally am not a big fan of that, and I'll show you why. Because this is a project I worked on for a healthcare client, and their main goal was selling, it was in New Mexico, and their main goal was selling insurance plans to the people of New Mexico. And you know, most providers of insurance plans, there's not a lot of differentiation, right? They're all providing essentially the same plans at this point. And they had like a key piece of differentiation, which was they also gave free fitness memberships to all of these different gyms. Like that was something unique that they had. Does anyone want to guess where that information lies on this page? Any guesses? In that PDF. And if I had done an automated sweep, I wouldn't have found that. Right? So what that led to was not only a conversation of don't do that, it was also a conversation of, well, why? Why would you do that? Right? Was it a problem with the approval process? Was it a problem with your CMS that you couldn't get to the content that you needed, so you just had someone upload a PDF? Like, what is the root of where we are so that we can fix that problem in the future? So this led to some key conversations with them about their workflow and about how their site was built that we were able to then undo as we rebuilt it. So had I just scraped this and gotten automated, this page exists, we would have missed that conversation completely. So I'm a big fan of doing your audits by hand. It can, like I said, it can be tedious, but it is definitely worthwhile to learn some very important lessons that can be hidden from you. So within that content inventory, here are some of the columns that I set up in the spreadsheet itself, right? So you're going to document the existing structure, very similar to a sitemap. You're going to document a page name, an existing URL. Part of the reason you're going to do that is because you may be also implementing future URLs, right? If you're changing your URL structure, it's important to kind of have all of that documented. You're going to be looking at template types, assuming that templates are existing in the current system. Content objectives, right? So the objectives could be buy this thing or submit this form, right? So hopefully there's a content objective on every page. If not, that's something you're going to want to revisit. And it might just be learn about X. That might be the objective, and that's okay. But if you can't nail down a specific objective for your content, then there's a problem. Looking at content elements, and then looking at existing metadata. So those are kind of some of the things that you set up in your spreadsheet. So let's break that down a little bit more. So content objectives, these are some examples. These are kind of specific to the CFPB. So we might have a page to educate about student loans. We might have a page to get users to submit something or to inform users about something. So these are going to be specific to the site that you're looking at, but typically it's going to be to learn, to buy, to submit, right? To action, to verb. That's how you want to phrase it. Then you can look at the content elements. So these are those reusable chunks that you see a lot of times in websites. And the goal is often to reduce the number of unique elements that you have within your site, right? So it's good to inventory, what do we have? And then you can start talking about what's working and what's not. But these are the things that you're going to recycle or reuse throughout the site. So this is an example of what that may look like in the end, right? Big, long, boring spreadsheet. And then you can add, as you start looking at like your future IA, you can add new pages. So you can actually use this to track your work as you continue. You can add new pages. You can start combining things. I've also used this to track where content is through the approval process as you get way off into rows X and Y and Z. That you can actually kind of use this as a tracking mechanism as well. So a little bit of double duty there. Once you get done with the content audit, now you want to do some analysis, right? You want to look at the qualitative value of the content that you have. So is it on brand? Is it readable? Is it understandable? How is it structured? Does it serve a purpose, right? And then you're going to want to look at it in the essence of like, am I going to keep it? Am I going to edit it? Am I going to delete it? So you can actually have a column that says, recommendation. We want to keep it. We want to update. We want to delete this page completely. How many people have heard the acronym ROT in terms of content? Good, that's nice. So what that means is redundant, outdated, and trivial. Those are three really key things that you want to look for in your content. Is this content replicated somewhere else on the site? That offers some serious problems, because if you update it in one place, is it being updated in the other? You get things out of sync, and all of a sudden people don't know what to trust. So redundancy is definitely a big issue, especially when you look at something like an intranet, right? If you have different versions of a travel policy in all the different places within the intranet, nobody knows what to trust. It becomes completely meaningless. So then you look at outdated, right? Is this an event from 2007 that's still living on my website? What value is that bringing? Should it actually be there? And trivial. Actually had this conversation with a CEO of a company. He wanted to put his personal blog on the homepage of his corporate website. And we had to talk about, like, that's actually very trivial for the users that are coming here. They do not want to read about your dog. So very important to look at, like, what value is this content bringing? You want to make sure that you kind of eliminate the trivial as you're prioritizing content. So then you're going to track your recommendations. So this is kind of a close-up view of that audit. So you can see, like, we might want to modify and add an intro. Here's new content. All this content currently exists in a PDF, so we want to fix that. So just some ideas of how that might look. Okay, so next we're going to move on to messaging strategy. So this is really about what are you communicating and how are you communicating it? So first we're going to talk about voice. I get a lot of people who ask questions about like the difference between voice and tone. Hopefully after the next 10 minutes or so, you'll have more clarity around that. So the voice is your brand's personality, right? So it might help establish trust. It helps connect with your audience. It creates a consistent touch point. The voice is the thing that when you read a site or when you look at any piece of content, you go, that belongs to this company, right? MailChimp is a great example. They have a very strong brand voice. Who are some other? I mean, there are a lot of great examples out there. Target has a very specific brand voice when you look at their advertising. So uniquely you. So it's something that you should be developing for your organization, and it should be consistent. Your voice should be consistent across channels, right? Whether you're blogging or you're tweeting or it's on a billboard or it's in an elevator, it should all feel like it's coming from the same organization, right? So it's really important to have consistent voice and to establish that up front. It's okay to customize your voice to specific audiences without contradicting yourself, right? So specifically within the CFPB, we talk to consumers and we talk to industry. So the voice is a little bit different because the message we're trying to convey, the feelings we're trying to convey are a little bit different, but it's always within the same umbrella of us, right? So your voice should never contradict each other. It's not like when we're talking to industry folk, it's antithesis of what we're just saying when we're talking to consumers, right? It all feels like it's coming from the same organization. One exercise I like to do when coming up with a voice is this, not that statements. So a lot of people can say like, oh, we're informative, right? Well, informative can mean a lot of different things. You can say we're smart, but there's a lot of different ways you can convey smart. So I like to say we're this, not that. We're smart, but not stiff, right? So that starts honing in on some nuances of that voice. We're helpful, but not pandering, right? You can start seeing a little bit more of where we're heading. We're understanding, but not condescending. We're friendly, but not conversational. That's a really good one because every website wants to be friendly, right? But there's a lot of ways you can be friendly. So honing in on the specifics of how you want to be friendly in a this, not that statement can really help get everyone in the room on the same page as to what they want the voice to be. So then we get into tone. So if voice is your personality, then tone is the emotional state, right? So this is specifically when we're talking about conveying a message to the user, we're gonna want different tones based on the context of what the user is looking at. So thinking about the CFPB, right? If I'm submitting a complaint, the user's in a very specific state of mind, right? I might be losing my house. I might be about to get fired or foreclose on something. Like they're in a very specific emotional state of distress, right? And that's very likely different than the state of mind they're in when they're trying to finance their education and they're coming to us for information about repaying their student loans and like how, what's the difference between a loan and a grant. So the tone of those two sections should be very different. Another example I like to give from like the healthcare industry is if you're talking to new moms about the well-being of their babies, the tone of that's probably going to be very different than the tone of, let's say, a hospice care page, right? Because the emotional state of your user is going to be very different. So again, you never want the tone to contradict your voice, but it can be specific to the context in which the user is approaching it. It's also really important to have that factor into your imagery as well, right? So when we talk about content, content isn't just written word, it's also visual language. So you want to look at how tone can be conveyed within your imagery as well. So there's actually some literary techniques that you can use to create different tones. So using soft consonants are more emotional than hard consonants, right? So hard consonants tend to be more intellectual. You can use alliteration to create warmth and familiarity. Using adjectives and adverbs, making your prose more flowery, that conveys a different tone than if you just state things hard into the fact. Structuring of sentences, right, using short fragments or bulleted sentences, it can give a much different tone than a long run-on sentence. And then even just using your verb choice. So if I say I walk versus I shuffle, there's different implications there. There's different connotations of those words. So really focusing in on the words that you're using to convey your message and making sure that the connotations of those words are what you're trying to convey. So this is kind of an exercise I like to do. This is a sentence that describes the CFPB on our website today. It says the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a 21st century agency that helps consumer finance markets work by making rules more effective, by consistently and fairly enforcing those rules, and by empowering consumers to take more control over their economic lives. It's kind of a dense statement, right? It's all there. It's completely factual. There's nothing wrong with that sentence. It's very matter of fact, kind of sounds a little corporate speak. There's a very stilted cadence to it. It feels a little bit formal. There's a by parallel structure here. So by making rules, by consistently, by empowering, that's at play. 21st century agency, that sounds a little technical, right? There's take control. There's that phrase, take more control over their economic lives. That's kind of forceful. It's maybe a little intimidating. So those are kind of the things when you break the sentence down that there's a lot of hard consonants in there as well. So I took that and I tried to adjust the tone, right, to something a little softer. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is an independent government agency that makes and enforces rules to ensure that banks and financial institutions operate fairly. We also empower consumers with financial education so they can make sound decisions about their personal finances. Just as factually accurate as the previous statement, but gives off a very different impression, right? It's much more relaxed. It's more plain language. There's a repeated S sound throughout that gives it a little bit more of an emotional tone. The use of we is a friendlier way to communicate. There's a repeated alliteration, enforces, ensures, educate, empowers, that breeds familiarity with the sentence. And it's also broken up into two sentences as opposed to one long connected sentence. So just to show ways that you can actually use literary techniques and word choices to completely change the way something is being communicated, keeping your facts completely the same throughout. You also want to talk about visual language, as I mentioned earlier. So, when we show a photograph, are we showing still lifes, objects? Are we showing people? Is it people smiling? Is it people standing in a hallway, right? Do we use stock photography? All of those things really should be part of your content strategy because they're part of how you're communicating, right? So you need to think about them, right? Are there certain colors you want to be using? Is there a diversity mix that we're aiming for? What is our use of iconization within the site? And then also even things like best practices. So things that may seem really redundant or familiar to us, something simple as upload your photo in 72 DPI. Those types of best practices should be, don't resize your photos up, right? Those are things that should be included here because there are a lot of people that are going to come to your content strategy for guidance, and they may not be as familiar with some of those best practices when it comes to photography or imagery. So you also want to talk about the content structure. So this is the organizational layout of the page. How is it all stitched together? What kind of headings are we going to use? When should you use a H2 over an H3? You want to make sure that it's easy to scan. You don't want to have big, dense chunks of content. You want to make sure that they're broken up and made for the web. How to use bullets, right? You want to make sure that there's consistency there. If you're gonna start a bullet with a verb, like all of the bullets should start with verbs. Are you going to use periods at the end of your bullets or not? Are they full sentences? All of those types of things should be considered. And even things like with bullets and lists, pointing out that they shouldn't be a random order, right? A list should be either alphabetical or in order of importance, or there should be a reason why the things happen in the order they do. And it's nice to point out that rule within a content strategy, again, for people who might not be as familiar with writing content. Another huge piece of this is your PDF strategy. And unfortunately, it's not good enough just to say never use them because there are cases where they are helpful. So it's important to kind of get a sense of when do we need to use PDFs and how should they be structured and how should we implement them and how often. An example of a client that did not have the same healthcare client as before, that had no PDF strategy whatsoever. So this is a list of the different kinds of plans that you can get. And this bottom one was also their most important. So looking at ordered lists, right? That probably should have been at the top as opposed to down here. This is where most people actually needed to go. And when you click on this, you get another PDF that opens that had all of the different all the different, plans, gold A, gold B, gold C. Anyone want to guess what happens when you click on one of those? Yeah, it was another PDF. I call it the Matryoshka doll syndrome of PDFs, right? It's just nested PDF under nested PDF. That was the worst case I've ever seen. but it happens, right? So understanding, building a strategy around that, you can prevent that from happening in the future. And I definitely recommend that you prevent that from happening in the future. Another great tool that I use is a copy doc. Anyone in here use copy docs right now for entering content? Basically, this is a template where you can, that everyone should be using when you're talking about content for your thing, your website, your product, where you put in your information, right? So it documents things like the page name, the page type, right, is a different template type, the URL where it will live, and then you can break up your content, you know, entering things like, so in brackets here is a button, and then underneath it shows where is this thing linking to. So this, for me, has been a great way to move things through clearance process, getting everyone's comments, you know, into a single document. And then this has been a fantastic way to translate to, you can hand this to a designer and they know what needs to go where, and they know where something's a button versus a link. And then you can hand this to a developer and they understand how this information needs to get put into a CMS. So it's a great way to communicate your content and break it up. And then it's also a great way to go like, wait, we don't have any content for this piece here. We need to get someone to write that. So it's a really good way to kind of track and organize your content. I definitely would recommend creating that if you don't already use something like that. So then we get into editorial guidelines. And this is, I think, the first thing that many people think of when they think of content strategy. They think of like the editorial piece of it. Basically what this is it's a handbook for writing to make sure that all of your content feels like it was written by a single person. Because there's nothing more jarring than coming in and reading, you know, 2 pages of content on the site that just sound like they're written by completely different people in completely different spaces. So the things that this includes are a style guide. So these are things like, do you use the serial comma or not, right? Do you use an ampersand versus spelling out A and D? Well, what about in headers? Well, what about in blog titles, right? You have to look at all the different instances that something might be used and define rules around it so that everyone can follow the same thing. So looking at first or third person, are you going to use we or us or they when talking about yourself? Jargon and terminology. So when we say Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, parentheses CFPB on first mention, but every other time we can say CFPB, or do we say it every time we spell it out? And then looking at abbreviations. Specifically within government, those are 2 big bullet points that it's important to have guidelines around because, you know, it's alphabet city here. So we speak in a lot of abbreviations and jargon. So it's important when we're communicating to understand how are we going to communicate those things to our users. Another piece of this is an editorial calendar. And this is important if you have any kind of featured content, you know, on your site. So it might be a blog, it might be events, anything that you're publishing out at any kind of regular basis. It's really important to have an editorial calendar to track who is responsible for it. You know, do we need a photo for it? Like this just helps make everyone's job easier if you understand this. And it also helps with planning so that it doesn't get to be Friday and you're like, oh, we need to post a blog post. We don't have anything to write about, and you scramble to get something done. So this comes back to that planning piece of a strategy, is putting this in place for anything that is published on any kind of frequency within your site. Then there's the editorial process. So this is the notion of who reviews, who edits, who's approving content before it's published, and then how do we respond to real-time issues that result. That was actually a really big piece. Early in my career, I was helping manage a social media campaign, and there was a snafu with a contest, technology didn't work, and there was this huge backlash on social media against what we were doing. And we didn't have any process in place of how to escalate. And so we were all scrambling to figure out what to do. And it got really intense. We had people threatening to burn down the restaurant chain. Like it got really intense. People were really, really upset about this, and we didn't have a process in place to address it. So really important to understand, how are you going to escalate something that happens on social media or within your blog or within commenting as you deal with it in real time, because those things can escalate pretty quickly, as I found out very early in my career. So then we talk about content types. This is kind of step 5. What goes on a page? What is the structure of a page? And then how is content chunked? So defining content types can definitely improve consistency across your site. And it's also a really crucial piece when you're dealing with responsive design and adaptive content. So what I mean by content types, if you're not familiar, is like a blog post is a content type, a video is a content type, right? For us, a regulation or a complaint would be a content type. If you're dealing with like an e-commerce site, a t-shirt might be a content type, right? That might be different than a pair of socks. So it's really important to kind of break down your content into the things that are reusable, and then to give meaning and assign metadata groups to them. So for instance, within a blog, because I think most people are familiar with the types of things that would go into a blog, you want to document like what is the structure of the blog, when do blogs expire, right? Do we keep them around for a year, 3 months, or 2 days? A migration plan. So if you're dealing with remodeling a site, redesigning a site, how far back are we going with the blogs that we're going to port over to the new site? Creation. So how are we creating these blogs? And then the metadata that exists around the blog. So, you know, every blog needs to have a date and a title and a short description and a long description and a link that it's going to go to and a picture, right? So defining what those things are is really important. And then you also need to define if it's different for mobile, right? So in mobile view with a blog, we don't want to show categories, right? Because we just ran out of room. We don't have a place to put them, or whatever your rationale is. That's not a good rationale, by the way, for leaving out categories. Don't do that. So then we get into something talking about mobile blobs versus chunks. Is anyone familiar with that phrase, blobs versus chunks? Okay, good. I'm glad I'm covering this. So blobs make it really hard. So this is a blob. A blob is like a WYSIWYG. I'm doing all my styling in line, and it gets, you know, dumped out onto a page, and it looks really pretty, but it makes it really, really hard to separate pieces of information into segments. So when you're dealing with, let's say, responsive, you know, there's no way for me to treat this piece of information different than this piece of information on a mobile phone. So what's been happening in content management systems is we've been having a lot more chunks, right? So you've got a title, a subtitle, here's your teaser, there's a mini teaser, there's the display date, the updated date, right? Everything is chunked out into pieces. This makes it a lot easier to handle content across any kind of display. So I think this is definitely a trend that I see with content management systems, especially as we look at all different kinds of devices right now. Now we're starting to create content for watches. Who knows what kind of content we're going to be creating, you know, what kind of displays we'll have 5 years from now. So this really helps kind of future-proof our content, because we're going to be able to say, we're going to be able to add other types. So now if we have a watch teaser, we could add that in here and put in the 10 characters or whatever that we need for our watch teaser in the future without having to completely rewrite every piece of content. So really it's about breaking up your content into kind of smaller, easier to digest pieces, so that you can dictate what happens to those pieces in different displays. Also really important to a content model. So these are, and when we talk about the three types of, or the three approaches to content strategy, this is all very much more in the technical side of things. So a content model is taking the type of content, looking at what metadata needs to exist for that type of content, right? So news, you've got the news title, the image, the date, the short description, the body copy. This was specific to a financial institution. So we had the channel that they were working in, the link target, so what the URL is going to be. So then you got the type, right? So it might be a date picker, a checkbox, a URL. This helps and what it is that they're trying to create. So, you know, I've often had an issue where a developer goes in and you go in the date field, and it's just an open text field, right? That's not as helpful as having a date picker. It's not as consistent as that. So this is kind of dictating those things. And then the description example. So this is also letting people know, if you have a checkbox, what are your two options that you're putting in your checkbox? If you have a pick list, what does that pick list look like? So this is another important piece within your content strategy to do, and to make sure that you have everything accounted for as well. Part of that all kind of goes hand in hand with a mobile content strategy. So looking at with a desktop versus a phone, versus looking at what are my breakpoints going to be, how is content going to be displayed on a phone? Are we going to show all of the different pieces of content? Are we going to move things around? So it's important to think about that. I think the standard these days has been, let's just, you know, file everything at the bottom as we go, but you can miss a lot of important content that way. Or have important call to action on your desktop that's up in the top right corner, all of a sudden on a phone is way down here. So it's something you need to think about. And finally, we get into governance. I'm I'm only going to touch on this really briefly because it's a really huge topic. But basically governance is rules around where content goes, how is it maintained, when is it deleted, who has access to it, if you're talking about any kind of secure system. Pieces of governance, there's people, process, and policy. So the people are the people who define governance and those who execute it. Process is how are we defining governance, and that's going to mature as your organization matures. And then finally, policies, which define expectation. So real quickly, people, it's really, really, really important to get an executive sponsor for a content strategy, because if you don't, you will not get resources, you will not get money to execute the thing, or to create the thing. So it's really important to find an executive sponsor for that effort. Have a leadership committee that can help bring in all the different pieces, clearance or public relations or whoever needs to be involved with getting content created. It's important to have representation within your content strategy, within your governance, so that they feel like they're a part of what's going on. And then obviously having experts and content curators that are actually going to be the people doing the execution of content. Processes, so who's entering the content, who's approving it, what's the life cycle, when does content expire, what are the review cycles? All of these questions should be answered within a governance plan. When you're dealing with policies, so what are the security and permissions that we need to have in place? Who can edit, who can view? And the other part of this is it's really important to as people take on these job roles, it's really important to write them into their annual reviews and into their actual job responsibilities so that they can be held accountable for these things. Otherwise, it's something that kind of gets pushed to the back burner, like any task that you're not really being judged on can do. So it's important to write this into part of their job requirement as well. So I just stood up here for 40 minutes and told you all this stuff. Now what are you going to do with it? So hopefully you can discuss how content strategy is going to fit into your project lifecycle, depending on what you're working on. You can identify content strategists, or maybe that's going to be yourself, and identify an executive sponsor to help lead the charge toward implementing a content strategy within your organization. You can start defining a mobile content strategy, which is kind of a micro piece of this. It's a nice way to start. And then you can also start honing your brand voice and contextual tones. So those are all kind of some different ways that you can get started bringing a content strategy in. So if you don't remember anything else, you can remember there's six kind of parts to this, right? Inventory analysis, messaging, editorial guidelines, content types, and then of course, governance. Here are some amazing books that help kind of get me passionate about this topic. Highly recommend them. I believe there's going to be a blog post that'll have these detailed in them as well. And this is actually the order in which I would recommend reading them to kind of get a really nice sense of content strategy and where it fits within the web and how it's evolved over the years. And that's it. Thank you. I think we're at the question. If anyone has any questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Got some time to
so
answer.
If anyone in the room wants to ask questions, we'll use the mic and kind of pass it around so people watching can hear. And if folks are watching the live stream, they could use 18F Live hashtag on Twitter, or put their comments and questions into the Google Hangout. So does anyone have a question? Emily.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm sorry. I am Emily, and I am on the content team here at 18F as a content designer. And one of the things that we talk about all the time is getting buy-in for plain language rewrites. And it's something that we struggle with all the time across agencies.
Yes.
Do you have any strategies for ways to assuage fears or bring people on board?
Yes, actually, this is something I've dealt with within the clearance process of the CFPB as well. So the approach that I took that worked well in my specific circumstance was I wrote the language to what I thought it should be. And then as it went through the clearance process, people commented on it, and I would start commenting back. And then what we did is we actually all sat in a room together and we talked through the comments. So we'd say, well, what is your thought about changing that word? Why can't we use that word, right? So I would try and really find, similar to how you look at a user, right? How you kind of dissect a user's intention, you can do that same thing with your stakeholder. So you can say, well, what is it about that word that scares you? What are the risks with that word or that phrase or that statement or that paragraph or whatever it may be? and really try, well, how about, could we say this with this? And so it was really like a give and take in person. But by the time we left that meeting, we essentially had cleared all of the hurdles. We'd figured out, I gave in and gave them some language that maybe wasn't as plain, but then they gave me some room too. So it was very much a give and take kind of joint conversation. And that seemed to work really well. So really trying to suss out like, what is the fear around that specific phrase? And also explaining to them why that phrase might be confusing to a user. I also found that to be really effective. If you could help put them in our user's shoes, right? We're here to communicate. We're here to help protect, American consumers. And if they don't understand what they're reading, then we're not doing our jobs, right? So kind of putting it in perspective of the mission can sometimes help as well. So hopefully that helps you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Situations people have run into?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
I'm Julie, and I work with OPM.
Mhm.
And I'm on the USA Jobs team.
Great.
So all of us know that we got a lot of content issues on USA Jobs.
Sure, yeah.
And so we are now trying to put everything in plain language. We've got such a vast degree of users.
Mm-hmm.
So it's our thought that if we speak to those outliers, like those people who aren't computer savvy or those people who aren't familiar with federal speak,
Mm-hmm.
that'll kind of cover
Mhm.
everybody. Is that the right strategy to use, or are we going to offend those people who are more federal savvy? Because we're really trying to reach those people who aren't in federal government.
Sure. Yeah, the rule of thumb with content is right at an 8th grade level. So it really is appealing to like the lowest common denominator of your users that are, when they're talking about literacy or familiarity with a subject or anything like that. So really boiling it down to as plain language as you can. I've never seen an instance where that offends somebody who understands it, who understands at a higher level. I think it's more important to make sure that you're grabbing that user segment that isn't maybe as technical as what you're talking about. And when you're talking about deciding whether something is plain language or not, right? Because those are a lot of conversations. Well, that makes sense to me. Well, you wrote the policy. Of course, it makes sense to you. So in having those conversations, one tactic that I found helpful is to have the person read something out loud, have someone who didn't write it read it out loud, and then from what they just read, tell you what it meant, right? Because if in that amount of time they can't remember, they can't parse out what they just read and then regurgitate it back to you, then it wasn't simple enough. Right? If I read a whole thing and I'm like, I don't really understand what that says, or it doesn't register that quickly, then you need to boil it down even more.
Are you doing any testing? I'm sorry, all the time. The feature that we're getting ready to release, we actually tested 5 times now, and it's getting ready to go to developers. And that's why we're right now doing our content for our pop-ups. So we make sure that the people understand that. And we did do a lot of outliers, which is great. We did some high school kids. We did some older people who aren't computer savvy, so we know
great.
where they are. So we had a lot of outliers. At first, people were like, why are we asking those people? But we have, and we're ready to put the content in and send it Friday to our developers. So.
That's another great point. Thank you for asking that question. If she was testing, is test your content. That is a huge piece of usability, is not only testing your design patterns and your UI and your flows and all the things that we think about when testing, test your actual content. Because a lot of times you're going to find that header didn't really get across what you're trying to get across, or right. And again, it's those little things. Most of the time, the body copies pretty well. It's the little things, the label on the field. Like, I didn't really know that meant the thing that you were trying to convey. So it's really important to test actual content.
And I was happy to hear you say read it out loud, because I'm a firm believer in read it out loud.
It's
because it sounds really good in your head, and then when you say it out loud, you're like, well, what did you just say?
And honestly, phonetically, as you read something out loud, if you find someone stumbling on those words, people read out loud in their heads. Does that make sense? So they're probably going to be stumbling on it as well. So it's a really good barometer of is something flowing? Is it making sense? So.
I'm struggling with this because I came from the military for 22 years.
Yeah.
And it's like straightforward, and everybody's like, lighten up a little bit. And I'm like, I don't know how. So we do have to read my stuff out loud.
Mhm.
So that
That's good. That's great.
can understand it.
That's great. Keep doing it.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
We have a couple online.
Perfect.
Okay, so Janine asked about the the life cycle for a blog post. She says, if a blog post is part of your organization's living history, but one has to consider the life cycle for information, how long should a blog post exist on a site?
It's a great question, and the answer is going to be different probably for every organization. So you really have to think about what is meaningful for your organization, right? 2 years is kind of like, if you don't have time to really sit down and plan that out, 2 years is kind of the baseline that I've seen. Anything older than that, people tend not to trust the information. So that's not to say that something that's 3 or 4, 10 years old doesn't have meaning or value. Just as a general rule, if you don't have time to really sit down and look at what makes sense for my organization, 2 years is a nice kind of blanket time frame. But the important thing is that you have the conversation, right? And if you have a conversation and say, we never want to delete anything, that's a valid choice. You just need to make sure that your content is organized in a way that people can still find things and that your dates are very prominent, right? And then you account for the fact that there's going to be so much content as you move toward the future, so.
All right, there's a second one, which is, do you have any tips for managing content on multilingual websites? From Laura wants to know.
That's a great question. I have not dealt with too many multilingual sites where I've been part of the language piece of things. I would imagine that using a lot of spreadsheets is probably helpful for tracking. In terms, I think a lot of it would also depend on the content management systems. Are the different translations managed in the same content management system? Are they cloned instances of each other? So I think a lot of that would depend on how it's being implemented. I think dealing with the chunked versus blobbed content, right? The more chunked your content is, I imagine the easier it will be to translate as just a general rule. But yeah, I wish I had better specific advice for that. But I think a lot of it would depend on how things are set up. So, great. Any other questions or thoughts or issues people have had dealing with content within their organizations?
There's got to be issues, and people must have things that they'd like to.
So for our site is
All right.
basically,
Do you mind?
yeah, sure. Hello. So for our site is basically a blog. So the whole goal is to get different voices in. So we're telling different stories.
Mhm.
We talked about, trying to make your site have some cohesion.
Yes.
The rules kind of around that, because we don't want to lose the different
It's a great
voices.
question. That's a great question. So when I talk about consistency of voice, I'm talking about a brand voice, right? So then if you're dealing with a blog post or a site that's mostly blogs with, let's say, lots of different contributors, each contributor should have their own voice, right? And they should stay true and consistent to that voice, because they're essentially developing personas within that brand umbrella, but they're creating their own personal brand. So when I speak about brand, I'm talking about like a personal brand versus a umbrella brand. So yes, you would definitely want to have consistent voice within that one person's blogs, right? So blog A by one person should sound like blog B by one person. But if you have another persona, that can be completely different, right? And that's definitely recommended when you're talking about a situation like that. Any other questions? Yes.
So I know CFPB is a pretty big team for content management, but for those who maybe work with smaller teams, what are good overlaps for things like, personally, I'm doing all of our UX and our content strategy, so I'm trying to figure out which parts are kind of easiest to chunk out and kind of delegate to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Would IA and content strategy maybe go best together? What kind of usability can I overlap with this?
It's a great question as well. I think a lot of it comes to the strength of the individuals you have on your team. So it's UX, content strategy, design, IA, they're all kind of part and parcel of the same thing under a giant umbrella of design. So I definitely see a lot of similarities between IA and content strategy. I do tend to lump those two things together when possible, because content strategy deals with a lot of structure, and a lot of times I'll have somebody who's designated as an information architect helping complete the audit at the beginning, right? So that might be a dual task. When you're dealing with things like editorial guidelines, that tends to move towards someone with writing, copywriting, content strategy skills, right? That's not something I would necessarily give to a front-end developer unless they were a fantastic writer and had a lot of interest in doing that. And then when you get to the more technical side of things with the metadata and the structure, that's where you can start kind of asking developers help for things, or IA, because a lot of information architects also have a strong background in metadata and organization of that kind of information. So there's a lot of overlap there, but it really does come down to the individual skills within your team. And in the end, I'm a fan of doing the work, right? I don't really care who's doing it, as long as it's getting done and done well. I think everyone should be involved as much as possible. So.
This just came in
right.
just this last second on Twitter from Kevin Cropper. With an intranet, how do you enforce strategy on all the offices and staff putting up info, clearinghouses, reviews, limited rights?
I love that question. Intranets are near and dear to my heart. It's actually the project I'm working on currently at the CFPB. And the answer is you really need to have a very strong governance plan, and you really need to have buy-in both from your executive sponsor as well as from your department heads that kind of form your leadership committee. What that means is you first need to have guidelines, right? How should content be structured? Specifically with an intranet, you're dealing with a lot of what I label infobarf, which is just a whole bunch of stuff on a page, and it's impossible to chunk and it's impossible to find anything. So it's really important to have guidelines around, when you should create a subpage, how, do you need a table of contents at the beginning with anchor links that people can jump to things very quickly? Those are all really important things to have. And then there's a lot of training and education that needs to happen. I would recommend starting with, again, getting that sponsor of whoever, they need to be the ones helping enforce this, and then finding content champions within each of those divisions that are the ones who are actually doing the work. Sit down with them, have intense trainings, be available to them for their questions, because what I found is they want to do a good job. They want their content to be meaningful and to be helpful. Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting it out there. So most of the time, they're hungry for guidelines. They're hungry for information about how to do what they're doing better. Anything else? All right, great. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Natalie.